Hello, Sendhil.
Hi, Glenn.
How are you? I don't think, have you ever done this before?
No, I've never done this.
Okay, so I think we are supposed to introduce ourselves, and then we're supposed to talk, and, it's pretty informal.
Great.
So I'm Glenn Loury, economics professor at Brown University and Blogging Heads regular.
I'm Sendhil Mullainathan. I'm an economics professor at Harvard, and it's my first time to Blogging Heads.
Okay. So, Sendhil, two economists talking. Are we going to put them to sleep or what? Not if you do most of the talking.
I think we're both atypical economists. So if we're boring, it's just because we're boring people.
Okay, you're an atypical. I'm not sure I'm going to confess to atypicality. Although, maybe actually I want to embrace being an atypical economist because the typical economist is a boring lot. A person could say. On the other hand, what makes you such an atypical economist?
So I think for me, it's been an attempt to meld psychology more deeply and richly into what we do. I think that's been the most fun part of economics for me, is thinking harder about how people think and learning what psychologists teach us about that. I think that used to be more atypical 10 years ago. Maybe it's less atypical now, but it's still quite a miles away from macroeconomists saying what we need is more stimulus.
Okay, so you're a part of this behavioral economics movement. Do I understand? Is that the right label?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Behavioral economics, which is, let me see, I'm not a behavioral economist. I'm an old school guy. I don't know what kind of economist I am these days, but in any case, I don't have anything against behavioral economics, but let's try to define for the wider world. This is a departure from the tradition in economics inquiry of assuming that people act in a fully rational way on behalf of their well-defined interests and taking seriously what has been learned about the way that human beings actually make their choices and govern their behavior, what has been learned in the allied sciences of psychology, human cognition, and so on. Would you regard that as a fair definition?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I think for the typical listener out there, I think one of the difficulties in understanding what behavioral economics is that partly it's defined relative to a feature of economics which most people probably didn't fully realize, which is that economists' view of human behavior was somewhat narrow.
Okay.
And so let me just give one example. I mean, some of what we introduce is patently obvious, so I'll give one that's patently obvious, which is, pretty much every morning I intend to wake up at 6:30. So I put the alarm clock on at 6:30, and then what happens almost every morning is I hit the snooze button 2-3 times, and I wake up at 7.
Well, that's what the snooze button is there for.
The snooze button I think is a little evil because it's not clear I want the snooze button. I didn't get if I was going to wake up at 7, many times I think to myself, I wish I could just put the alarm at 7, then I get 30 minutes more of full sleep. Instead, what I got was 3 10-minute bites of restless sleep, and eventually I dragged.
But let me ask you this. If your theory is correct, it has the implication that we should find people disabling their snooze buttons.
Yes, that's one of the things I've wondered a lot about. I'll tell you, there's this, when I present this in talks, there's this interesting MIT Media Lab alarm clock that I show. It's called Clocky. And what Clocky does is it's got wheels.
Clocky has wheels.
Yeah, so this is great. And what happens is it's very rugged. And when the alarm clock goes off, when you hit the snooze button, Clocky rolls off the bed, and it rolls in a random direction in your room.
Oh, so you have to get up to get it the next time.
So the next time you gotta get up to get it. And as with everything in the world, the Japanese have improved upon Clocky. They have this little alarm clock which has got a helicopter, so that when the alarm clock goes off and you hit the snooze button, it takes off the next time to the air and stands at your ceiling and beeps. So now you got to stand up, jump, and grab this thing. So that's. Now, what's funny, though, is going back to your initial point, it's not clear why, even though all of us do feel, gosh, I've got the self-control problem with getting up on time, and I think a lot of us feel like it's not clear the snooze button is helping me, you're right that we'd feel a little naked just disabling the snooze button altogether. But there's this tension between the demand for sort of self-control, but not wanting to fully commit yourself either. And I think that tension kind of shows up in many places.
But now, what's so new about all of this? I mean, doesn't the great Thomas Schelling, Nobel laureate, go down in economics lore on the problem of self-command, having, the metaphor of Ulysses binding himself to the mast so as not to succumb to the temptation of the sirens, putting a bowl of peanuts on the other side of the room so that I don't eat too many calories,
exactly,
et cetera, et cetera. Hasn't this all been said?
Yeah, I think in some deep sense it has been said. I think what I would say is that it's now working out all the consequences of those insights for social institutions. So I'll give you an example of something like that we're thinking about right now. So take the health insurance debate. I think as economists we tend to think health insurance is about after we put people on health insurance, one of the biggest problems is moral hazard. So if a procedure costs $1,000, yet you only face a copay of $20, lots of people who value it at less than $1,000.
Yeah, way less than $1,000, but more than 20. Yeah,
we'll undertake it. So people, I think economists tend to think, okay, overutilization is the problem with health insurance. But here's an interesting fact: a lot of people, and this gets onto the issue of poverty, but a lot of people who face no copays for medications, like diabetics who need insulin, end up not taking them. And that's not overutilization. In a funny way, that's underutilization. And when we look at the benefits of taking insulin, say you've got an insulin pill, it's very high return. It's not even costing you anything. It's just like taking a moment out of your day to pop it.
Why don't they take it?
Why don't they take it? And so this says, self-control, which as you point out is a well-understood concept. We now need to understand what it means for the plethora of institutions that economists tend to analyze. And you can see how it just infiltrates so many things where we have preconceptions. And in health insurance, I think one of the things that, at least in my work, I'm starting to feel is that just as much as there is overutilization due to moral hazard, I think there's a lot of underutilization. And some of the big costs are actually the consequences of underutilization in the future. So if you don't take your medication now, it leads to a very expensive procedure that society has to bear in the future. So that your self-control problem also becomes a social consequence. You didn't take the diabetes medication, you're worse off, and we have huge healthcare costs as a result.
May I say that I wonder whether over and underutilization is the right axis for this analysis, in that it's not, it seems to me as I listen to you, not really the extent of utilization as such. It's whether or not the behavior of the patient complements the provision of whatever services and medicines and so forth might be costly, so as to produce the best health outcome. And that could involve less or more utilization of, the taking of pills or
that's right,
or the getting of procedures or whatever it might be. But it's a governance problem at the level of the individual whose behavior is not, for whatever the reasons, you say self-control, and I suppose there could be other stories as well, whose behavior doesn't complement the services that are being provided in a way to generate the best health outcome.
That's great. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And I think that the moral hazard story says that my behavior doesn't complement the provision of health because I just face too low a price.
Yeah.
Whereas in the diabetes example, we don't think the problem is I'm facing too low a price. We think it's something else. Self-control is one hypothesis, and maybe there are other, attention, not remembering, there are a bunch of other things that might work.
Okay. So supposing a person can produce a handful or more examples of the kind that you just did, arenas of important behavior, bearing on social outcomes that we care about, where I don't know what to call them, perversities, pathologies, I don't know what the right word is here, deviations from sort of rational or self-interested behavior for some psychological reason causes a problem. Suppose you can identify a bunch of these. How does this amount to a science or a theory? Nothing wrong with investigating these cases, but what does it all add up to? Or is that a fair question?
That's a very fair question. I think that one of the things that you worry about is you worry that are we just going to get mired in a bunch of, little examples?
Yeah.
And we're never really going to generalize to something broader. And how are we going to build a framework? So if I ask that goes back nicely to your Schelling examples. I think the real challenge for behavioral economics in the next 20 years is to move from the Schelling peanuts examples and Ulysses examples to say, are there robust frameworks that incorporate these ideas that help us say something. And I think people have done a pretty good job of that. Like, I think David Leibson has done a good job of building a consumption framework that is different from the traditional consumption framework. It is systematic. It isolates one component of the self-control problem, and it helps us make sense of a variety of empirical regularities. For example, why in the data on household finances do we see a large set of people simultaneously borrowing at pretty high rates while holding lots of liquid savings as well? Yeah. So they've got credit card revolving debt at 18%, and they've got liquid cash at 0 or 1 or 2%.
Yeah, that's a real puzzle.
And so I think you're right. If in 20 years behavioral economics remains a set of little examples, I think it'll be hard for it to be a substantive contribution to science.
I wonder what you think then, behavioral economist extraordinaire that you are. No, I mean that with all sincerity. I was very impressed with your the book proposal of yours that I saw with Shafir. Is that his name?
Yeah, Shafir. Yeah.
We can talk about that perhaps later. But I'm just wondering, so call me an old school economist. Let me be a conventional old school economist trained at MIT in the early mid-1970s as a theorist, and thinking thoughts of the following kind. I can have a market with people trading, let's say, securities. And many of those people may be subject to all manner of anomaly with respect to their present versus future orientation, their assessment of risk of high loss with low probability, their planning and ability to execute, intertemporal plans over time to actually stick with what they, commitment problems, etc. They could be subject to all manner, and we could identify them with all kinds of strange examples. And yet, I might think that, what with arbitrage, the ability of people to lever and raise large sums of money, and the sort of anonymity and the frequent transactions that happen on markets, and the globalization of markets, and the large sums that can move back, that at the end of the day, the behavior of the market would not be very much affected by these, even if they were large in number, individuals subject to these various psychological anomalies and lacunae, because prices would be driven and large volumes of trade would be under the control of the relatively small number of people who were, if you will, rational. That the observation of a plurality of traders who exhibit certain behavioral anomalies doesn't take me very far, perhaps, in understanding what the equilibrium behavior of markets would be, and that the logic of maximization, and you see where I'm going with this.
Oh, definitely.
And self-interest might still be a relatively good guide to what arbitrage-prone markets would generate, even if most of the traders in them were subject to this or that, departure from rationality. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think that what's specifically interesting about that example is that I think that when you read the early literature on behavioral economics, very early literature, one of the counter-arguments to what you said was always, well, there are a lot of markets we care about which are not, asset pricing where there's enormous amounts of arbitrage. When I go to make consumer purchases, I go to buy a home or I go to buy a car, there's no real room for someone to arbitrage my mistake.
Yeah.
And so I think that was the first line of defense, and I think that's still accurate. So if you look at the mortgage crisis, for example, that was driven by a lot of people making individual choices about mortgages, where it was very hard for anyone to arbitrage their error. We could have potentially arbitraged the mispricing of mortgages.
Indeed.
But if you took too big of a mortgage for yourself, that was very hard for an arbitrager to come and essentially buy your decision and mistake it. That was the first, I think, response that people had to that stuff. What I've been surprised at, I think a lot of people are surprised at, is that it turned out that the single most successful area for applied behavioral economics so far has actually been in asset markets. And I think it's been incredibly successful for a strange reason, which is there were these papers on arbitrage, which I think clarified part of the issue. And that's that if you're an arbitrager and say you're smart money, and you know that there's a bunch of traders that are making a mistake. So the asset is valued at 10, and they're trading as if it was worth 12.
Yeah.
So in the literature, they call these noise traders. They just think overvalue it. Now, what's funny is that you could argue that as an arbitrageur, your best strategy is to try and short that thing back to 10.
Right.
And there are two problems with that model. The first problem is that suppose the noise traders think it's worth 12, and you think that the bubble might get worse before it gets better.
Indeed.
Then, as an arbitrageur, you may actually say, hey, the way these bubbles tend to work, if it's 12 now, it'll probably go to 13 or 14.
Yeah.
So now, the smart money is actually, kind of exaggerating the mistake of the dumb money.
Right.
And even riding it up. And so we actually have pretty good empirical evidence of this now on the around the internet bubble. So if you look at, there were some prominent economists who in 98, I think correctly said the internet was overvalued. Internet stocks were overvalued in 98.
Yeah.
And I think they correctly noticed that, but incorrectly decided the right strategy was to short it. So they actually bought a bunch of put options, and they lost their shirts because the market kept going up.
They missed
until
the
2000.
timing of the turning point.
Yeah, but if you looked at the hedge funds, what's really amazing is because you can get some of this proprietary data on the hedge funds and what they hold, and they were really very heavy in internet stocks, all the way up the bubble. They just happened to get out a quarter before everyone else did. So it's not clear that the hedge funds, which are probably the smart money in that example, were actually getting rid of the bias. They were actually,
I heard George Soros, he was being interviewed by Fareed Zakaria a few weeks ago, say exactly this. He said exactly this. He said,
interesting.
I see a bubble, I buy into it. That's how I make money. It was almost like he was a poster child for the point that you're making right now, on the idea that he would be smarter than the next fellow about when to get out.
Yeah,
so he was saying, arbitrage doesn't necessarily, help because it can really push things, push things in a more volatile direction. And this was his case for regulation, which I assume is where a behavioral economist is often going to come out as well, no?
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll tell you one quick story about this Soros thing, which is there's this beautiful game called the Beauty Contest, which you can play with any classroom. It's a lot of fun. What you do is you say to people, I want all of you to guess, to write down a number between 0 and 100.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the average of those numbers in the entire class, and whoever is closest to 2/3 of the average.
Oh, yeah, I know this game.
This is great, right?
Yeah.
So, if you were like a real smart money person, you'd say, well, look, it's 2/3 of the average. So the equilibrium keeps pulling, and the only equilibrium is we all guess 0.
Right.
So then you would guess 0. You're never going to win this game by guessing 0. Because there are a lot of people in that room who are not going to realize this, and they're going to put 50 or, 33 or whatever it is.
But notice, once we allow that there are some people who are going to put down the not rational thing, then the rational people's rationality leads them to not put down what would have otherwise been the rational thing.
That's exactly it. And just like the Soros example, the smartest money here is the money that's one step ahead of the dumb money, not the money that's 50 steps ahead, because that's not going to help them. So it's kind of right. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now going back to your regulation question, I think that's the place where a lot of people want to go with this, is to understand what ought we to do. I think I'm probably more so than others. I'm very sympathetic that we need regulation. But I think that I feel it's still early days. There's a lot we need to understand. There's a lot we need to learn. Because I think what we had was a flourishing of the literature that you contribute a lot to this. The literature in the 70s and 80s, and that kind of helped us understand how asymmetries of information translate into regulatory interventions, and how the facile move from saying, look, there's an asymmetry of information, there's a market failure, therefore we have to regulate this way, how that move can often be made too simply and simplistically, and regulation can work badly. I think we're going to see something similar happening like that in the behavioral context as well. Regulation is the mixture. So here's an example that in my own work I've written about that has a similar flavor. I think a lot of people have been driven by data on defaults, where you show that for, say, 401k participants, if you give them a form when you join the firm that says, in order to sign up for your 401k, check this box.
Right. People don't check it as much as they really should for their own interests.
Exactly. Whereas if you give them a form that says, if you wish to not participate in your 401k, check this box. Right. All of a sudden, a lot more people participate.
Now you've just changed the configuration so that the same underlying behavioral trait, which is a kind of inertia to check the box, works in favor on the average of the people who are in the thing. So your paternalism is definitely there, but it's light touch.
It's light touch. And I think what people have tried to do is to take, in my mind, too much from that example. So, for example, people want to say, look, why not use this for mortgages?
Right.
We'll say that the default mortgage is a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. And I think that's an example of kind of making the move from the behavioral economics to the regulation in a naive way. And I say naive because the firm has a lot of levers at its disposal. So, for example, I remember the other day, this was a few years ago, I went to a rental car counter. I rented the car, and that always takes way too long. I have no idea why that takes as long as it does in modern society. But the guy gives me a form, and he says, put your signature here and put your initials here, 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 and here. And I did it. I don't know what default I was overriding. Yeah. I don't know what it was. Right. But he told me to do it, so I did it. And it's just, the firm has a remarkable capacity to push you or pull you away and really undo any default. And so I think while these sort of soft touch things could work in some contexts, I think we have to just remember the firm has, open to it many more soft touch interventions than we have.
No, I see the point here. I think it's really a very good one. And it makes me think that one, and I guess this would be so, you can tell me about the literature, that one research program for behavioral economists would be to look at how in a competitive marketplace do firms exploit. I mean, if we, the researcher, the analyst, know that people are, I don't know what, under-saving or, can't consistently allocate their time or their resources in a way that's whatever. If we know that, and we can see that and can find evidence of it, then surely profit-seeking firms that want to sell people stuff they don't need, want to get them to agree to contracts that on terms that are really disadvantageous and so forth, will also know this. And is there any reason to think, here's my question, that the forces of competition between firms for business would eliminate the ability of firms to exploit the non-rationalities that behavioralists will have identified in the behavior of consumers? Right. Should we expect that advertising will lead to something that doesn't, prey on the weaknesses and the sort of psychological lacunae of non-rational behavior among consumers? Or is there reason to think that there, profit-seeking firms, insurance companies, lenders, or whatever, need to be, forcibly restrained from doing certain things precisely because otherwise people will be preyed upon?
Yeah, I think that's, you said research agenda. I think that's exactly the right research agenda. And I think we don't know as much about it now as we would like, but I hope, as the coming years, that exactly the questions you're raising get answered. I think we have, I can give you some examples for why the answers are not obvious, which is, I think, what makes it interesting. So, for example, take the health insurance example we gave before. Now, suppose that you're my client and I'm the health insurer, and I'm interested in setting copays to maximize profits. Now, how would I set my copay for your diabetes medication? If I'm a short-term insurer, then basically I know I have you for 2-3 years, but maybe you'll eventually end up on Medicare, and I know that, or Medicaid, and I know that. Well, then I really shouldn't be thinking about the fact that I should just be thinking about the cost outlay of the diabetes medication. I should just say, well, look, Glenn uses less diabetes medication when I raise the copay on it, so I should just find the right copay to minimize my outlay as long as Glenn still values this as insurance. Suppose, on the other hand, I'm a long-term insurer, so I know that I'm on the hook for you till you're 75, because, then I internalize that if you don't use the medicine rightly, you're going to be very sick later and I'm going to have to pay. Yeah, exactly. So all of a sudden the market force in one case really kind of is, in one case, is blind to my problem, and it says, I don't care. All I'm going to look at is Glenn's demand curve. He doesn't want insulin. It's his problem. In the other case, now I care quite a bit. And so you can see that it's an intricate mixture of the nature of the transaction, and how your error may affect my profit function. And there are a lot of such kind of examples. So suppose that I can sell you on a product. You might think, well, it's always in my interest to kind of get you to buy stuff that you don't need. On the other hand, suppose that there's, in my policy, people really demand a very generous return policy. That's just something people want. But once you have that, all of a sudden, it's not obvious that it's in my interest to sell you lots of stuff that you later go back and regret, because now I'll have you come and return it, and then I'm screwed because I have this open box thing that's not worth as much, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So there's sort of, it's an interesting, it's intricate, and I think that's what makes it an area that we're really going to have to tackle in a much more careful way than simply saying, now let's go out and regulate firms.
Yeah, that sounds good. Let me shift a little bit because I wanted you to have a chance to talk a little bit about your work with Shafir on scarcity. You guys are not modest. The new science of scarcity. Wait a minute. When I first took my first economics course in the 1960s, one of the very first things I learned was economics was the study, the allocation of scarce resources to competing ends, blah, blah. Scarcity is right at the heart of the very definition of the discipline, has been for 250 years. Yep. So where do you get off?
Yeah, exactly. No, we were doing it to piss off people.
A new science of scarcity.
Exactly. At least we didn't call it the
snapper.
Yeah. At least we didn't call it the first science of scarcity. At least we were a little humble. We did this a little bit to kind of provoke, and I think the reason we did it is, let me just give you an interesting example.
Yeah.
Suppose you go to dinner tonight, and at dinner, it's a nice, fancy restaurant, and the chef says to you, we've got a special dessert, and it's a unique dessert.
Mm.
He describes it, sounds wonderful, and he says, but it's $40. Now, how would you think about that? Now, you might say, is $40 a reasonable price for a unique dessert? You might go through those calculations. But for people like you and me who happen to be gifted with lots of money, we're lucky.
Yes, we are.
The one thing that we don't think about is, where will that $40 come from? Now, if on the other hand, we're very busy. So if someone says to you, you're going to do a 30-minute phone call a week from now, like we're doing right now, we say, well, where is that 30 minutes going to come from?
Yeah.
We actually make a trade-off. But notice how, as an economist, we're equally physically scarce. We don't have endless budgets. We have a budget constraint, no matter how much money we may have, and we have a time constraint, no matter how busy or not busy we may be. So from a physical sense, everything is scarce. But what's profound, I think, for me, is that from a psychological sense, some things don't actually have the sense of scarcity. We don't treat them as if they're scarce. I mean, I think the best part of having a lot of money is I almost never make trade-offs. Most of the time, I don't feel like I actually have a money constraint.
Can I just hold on, because I really want to hear the whole story, but I just got to interject here. What then becomes of demand theory? If I take you seriously, all the stuff I've been learning for years and teaching my students, for decades, about trade-offs and difference curves, marginal rates of substitution, relative prices, changes in relative... What becomes of demand theory if my going in basic assumption is that for some kind of things people make trade-offs and for other kinds of things they don't?
Yeah. No, I think it's very compelling because if you think about your own experience, imagine you walked into a cafe in a foreign, in Atlanta.
Yeah.
And they had a latte and it was for $5. You could imagine saying, that's a ridiculous price for a latte, I'm walking out. Now what's funny is, that wasn't a trade-off you made. You didn't say, I don't have enough money to buy that latte. You had a reference price, a price you thought was fair. This just seemed too much, so you're not going to do it. So there's kind of two different modes by which prices enter our calculus and enter our choices. One is a literal trade-off. And we do see this. So we've done surveys with the poor where we ask, so here's a classic example. We ask both the poor and the rich, here's a television. You're thinking of buying it. What are the questions you might ask yourself? And the things that come up are things like, do I need a TV? Is it a flat screen? How many inches does it have? But the poor always put in their top list, what do I have to give up to buy this thing?
Now, I hear what you're saying, and forgive me, audience out there in Blogging Heads land, if this is a little bit technical, but here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that the marginal utility of money is a sufficient statistic for all of these commodity-specific alternative comparisons that you might be talking about. So that the person doesn't need to actually execute the cognitive exercise. If I bought this for $5, I wouldn't have $5 to buy that, whether that are a whole list of specific goods. All they have to know is the marginal utility of money is X, and $5 times my utility of this latte is bigger than X.
Yes.
Do you see what I mean?
Yep. I know exactly what you mean.
So I'm not buying your. You're setting up this. I'm so time constrained. If somebody asks me for 30 minutes, I'm going to think very carefully about what I can't do with those 30 minutes. The poor are so money constrained that if they're asked for $5 for a latte, they're going to think very carefully about what their kids are not going to be able to eat or whatever if they buy this latte. I'm not buying this kind of metaphor or sort of storyline about how people make choices. I'm thinking that the received theory tells me that if they are utility maximizers, that they can make these one-off decisions without having to do explicit commodity-specific trade-offs, but just by making reference to some, indicator that measures for them what the value of the dollar is, which they can set against the value of any particular thing that they're considering to purchase.
Yeah, no. So that's a great benchmark to start with. And so let me tell you an interesting experiment that kind of moved us away from that benchmark, which I think kind of gets at the heart of what you're asking. So imagine this is another great classroom experiment that you can do. It's wonderful. So you give half the class the following question: would you you've been shopping all day for a leather jacket that's worth $100, and at the end of the day you have seen it at a store for $100, the one that you're at right now, but you remember 20 minutes across town it was selling for $80.
Yeah.
Would you go 20 minutes across town to save the $20? And some percentage of people will say yes.
Yeah.
The other half of the class is given the same question, but we replaced the $100 leather jacket with a $1,000 computer. And again, it's $1,000 here and $980 across town, 20 minutes.
Yeah, they don't bother.
Would you go 20? They don't, and
it's the same $20 and it's the same 20 minutes.
Yeah, the same $20, the same 20 minutes, but we find big differences.
Yeah. I'm not surprised at all that you would.
Yeah. And what's really interesting, what was really eye-opening for us is, for the poor, you find no differences. They're much more rational on this question.
Oh, wow. That is a finding, Sendhil.
And that, I thought, was very eye-opening when I saw that. Because that, to me, says this notion that, what you need to know is the marginal value of money. What is it really worth? In a sense, the poor are attuned to that. We, on the other hand, because money doesn't matter, we don't need to use up cognitive space making these kind of exact calculations. We kind of, decide, and I don't waste bandwidth on it.
That's pretty interesting. I agree. I think that's really quite interesting. Okay, I want to ask you something else as we, time is moving along.
Yeah.
You guys talk a lot about the poor. I mean, in your Science of Scarcity, and please take the opportunity, if you like, to explain more of exactly what it's about. But
yeah,
you talk a lot about the poor. And you even have this idea of scarcity traps, where you say that behavioral patterns amongst the poor that are conditioned by their need to solve scarcity problems of the kind that confront people in poverty will exacerbate their poverty because they feed back in ways that undermine their ability to actually earn money or to conduct themselves in ways that fosters their economic progress.
Right.
And here's my thought, my question. It's a political kind of question. Okay, because are we not blaming the poor in this kind of a social scientific development? If we take our behavioralist stuff so seriously, might we not fall into the trap? Might you not fall into the trap, the moral trap now, of accounting for what are conditions mostly determined by systemic factors having to do with property relations, the distribution of power and opportunity in society, and all the rest, and then kind of packing them into an individualized, behaviorally pathological, self-defeating, the poor their own worst enemy narrative that points away from the political engagement necessary to change the basic structures of society in ways that advance the interests of the poor.
Yeah. I think that's hit on what is my biggest fear. And let me tell you how I understand it. It doesn't mean the fear is not legitimate still, but here's how I understand it. In this work that we're doing, what's been particularly eye-opening for me has been the deep analogy between scarcity in its many forms. So the example that really motivated us initially was, and that's in the book proposal I sent you to, is that I remember reading these qualitative interviews of people who are over indebted, and they say, look, I have to get out of debt, I'm going to stop borrowing, I'm going to tear up my credit cards, and I'm going to pay down all my debt, I'm going to be a better borrower from now on.
Yeah.
2 weeks later, what have they done? They bought a nice leather jacket. Maybe for $20 less, but they still bought a nice leather jacket. But while I was ruminating on this, and along the lines that you're describing, I was realizing that, you know what? I do literally the same thing. And the way I do it is that I tell Eldar, hey, Eldar, I'm grossly overcommitted. I'm not doing any project as well as I should.
Right.
What I'm really going to do is I'm going to stop taking on new commitments. Right. I'm going to finish the existing projects, and then I'm going to be a better chooser of projects from now on. What do I do?
Yeah.
2 weeks later,
I know.
I've taken on another project. So what that tells me is that I'm not questioning that the social structures matter, et cetera, but it tells me that there's something systematic, not to the poor as people, but to the conditions of having very little. And once we understand that the conditions of having very little, whether it's very little money, very little time, create certain types of behaviors, I think it helps us. Here's the positive spin I would put. It helps us understand that when we see apparently pathological behaviors, why is going back to diabetes? Why is insulin utilization so much lower amongst the poor?
Yeah.
We don't need to resort to something pathological about them as people. We can say, look, one reason diabetes utilization is so much lower among them is it's the same reason why the day before an exam you eat all sorts of junk. You're stressed. You don't have time to self-monitor and self-regulate on that dimension. But guess what? Every day is like an exam for the poor. And so it kind of, for me, it helps me bridge the empathy gap, and it helps me understand why behaviors that otherwise we may call pathological or not in fact pathological.
Fill in this missing spot for me because I'm not seeing it. Okay, I know this feeling of being overcommitted. You know, the article is due, it's overdue as a matter of fact. Okay? And I'm doing this all-nighter or this 3-dayer or whatever it takes to finish this thing. And I'm telling myself, I'm never going to let myself get in this position. Never. You know, I'm furious with myself for allowing myself to get into this position. And, of course, that is my permanent condition. I'm always in that, it seems like perennially, more than perennially. It seems like nothing I do ever gets done except that it gets done under duress at the, practically.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Letters of recommendation, research proposals, articles that need to be revised for journals. I mean, okay, now I make this master confession. But I'm a mess. Okay? Now, you just said that my being so time constrained is partly responsible for me not being able to manage my time very well. Why is that? What do you mean? Explain to me how that mechanism works, because it's not obvious to me that because I'm time constrained, therefore I would not be able to make the kinds of judgments that I need to make in order to be less time constrained.
Right. I think that what happens is that in time, to me, I can see it very clearly in myself, which is that once you enter this position of scarcity where everything is like, oh my God, I have to do it now, or I need the money now, there's a very natural heuristic you use. Psychologists call it cognitive tunneling. So in general, in any stressful situation, we're extremely good at tunneling mentally and visually. So, animals, when they're about to be attacked, they can look, their visual field really shortens into the thing that matters.
Okay.
Your cognitive field can really shorten into the thing that really matters. Okay. Now, that's normally an adaptive response. The problem is when you're under scarcity and you say, look, I've got to get this paper done right now because there's a deadline tomorrow. What do? You put off a bunch of other things. Now, if that putting off those things comes at no cost, then that's fine. But usually those things that you put off, you actually put off and the cost gets worse. So, for example, there's an email requesting you to come do X. And you say, look, I don't have time to deal with my email. So you now deal with the paper that's due today.
Right.
But now because you're a week late responding to that email, it's actually quite rude at this point to say no. It might not have been rude if you'd done it right afterwards and said, look, I'm too busy.
That's a good
So
example.
now, at that point, you say yes, but...
Even though I have less time now than I had a week before when I was inclined to say no.
Exactly. Exactly.
That works in the example. I don't know how much it generalizes, but I see the kind of idea that you're getting at. Yeah.
For the poor, I think a good example is that with payday lending. You really need to make money ends meet now. So you say, look, I don't know, but I just need to solve the problem today. A payday loan solves the problem today, but you know what? It makes the problem even worse tomorrow. But you're not. It kind of is very natural that that's not what you're thinking about at this moment.
Okay, so now
you've got this fire to fight.
I'm glad you mentioned this payday lending because it came up in the news. Maybe you saw this story about the Congressional Black Caucus. Did you see the story?
I didn't see this.
In the New York Times, I think they did a front page story 3-4 weeks ago. And basically what it was making the point that, not to rehash, bashing the Congressional Black Caucus. That's really not my intent, but it's very much on point here. It was making the point that members of Congress who happen to be African Americans, belong to the Congressional Black Caucus, and represent inner city districts where payday lending is big, have been recipients, or their nonprofit foundation from which they derive some benefits have been recipients of gifts from the payday lending industry. And awesome. Some members have opposed legislation promoted by consumer protection advocates that attempt to, in one way or another, and I don't know the details, limit the activities of the payday lenders because, in effect, low-income people end up entering voluntarily into usurious contracts where monies are advanced on terms that are really quite exorbitant in terms of the implicit interest rate.
Right.
So the point I was going to make is that if the poor are susceptible for reasons such as you describe, based on the implications of scarcity, for their extreme scarcity, their scarcity every day is exam day scarcity, for the way in which they manage financial decisions, then mustn't the role of government correctly be in this circumstance, Congressional Black Caucus notwithstanding, of regulating these markets? You wouldn't expect competition necessarily to protect these people. And they're going to be preyed upon to the tune of billions, and they're some of the weakest and most marginal people economically in the society. I mean, isn't there really an imperative for regulation in a situation like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I would link that what you're saying now back to what you said earlier, which is part of the interest for me in starting from the individual is that it helps me understand how to reinterpret the social institutions as well. So it helps me understand which social institutions are actually far more problematic than you might otherwise have thought. So I think payday lending is one where I actually come down on this sort of weird middle ground. What I mean by that is that the payday loan is both a mistake and a good thing. So it's a good thing in that it's helping you fight the fire now.
Yeah.
So it's immensely valuable to the person taking it. So that, I think, is hard for us to deny. If you look at how people use it, it's coming at times their car is broken down. They really need to fix the car to keep going to work or whatever it is. On the other hand, it's really problematic because it's pushing the problem to the future and making it much worse. So you're right, I think we need to understand both the negative part of it, the usurious rates and, the stuff that's really, really kind of problematic. But we need to understand the crucial role it fills for somebody who's sort of firefighting on a day-to-day basis and ask, is there a better institution that we can design? Is there a better institution that we can promote that helps solve this firefighting problem but doesn't have this really horrible negative feature of eating away at your future expenses? And just to put this in perspective, one of the things we're doing is thinking hard about economic stability of the poor. And a surprising thing is that if you look at sort of the balance sheet, or let's say the flow, the income and consumption flow of the poor in the U.S., you would find, I mean, we're getting the exact numbers now, but ballpark, 8 to 10% of their entire income goes to what we're calling a stability tax. What do I mean by that? I mean late fees, reconnect fees,
8
payday
to
loans.
10%, did you say?
It's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing.
8 to
Reconnect
10%?
fees.
Yo, jeez.
So it's not that the poor are not saving. They're saving 8 to 10%. It's just savings that's going out to a transaction cost to a very expensive financial intermediation vehicle. So it's like you're using the resources you have much worse because you're stuck in this trap.
Well, now, I guess the industry representative who's not a part of this conversation would be saying something like, have you got any idea what the default rates are in this industry?
Again,
do you know when a guy won't pay, what it costs you to even get a pittance? It's 20 cents on a dollar when it gets past 6 months due. We're barely breaking even in here.
Yeah, and so I would even say, look, whether you guys are making money or not, that's not the point. The point is so it's not even an issue of saying I don't want to demonize the industry. I want to say, isn't it funny that we thought the poor have too little money? When in fact, so I always say it this way, is that we tend to think the pie is too small. The problem is it's just cut wrongly. It's just, this whole leakage that's going because you're firefighting and, dealing with all these things and stuff getting done at the last minute and therefore utilities getting disconnected. Utility companies, for example, don't like having to disconnect you and reconnect you. They're not making money on that transaction.
No, I get it.
That's not their primary
So
business.
now let me suggest something else, because you're talking about scarcity of time and scarcity of money. I can think of one situation where both things are true. The single mom.
Yeah.
Dependent on welfare, low income, living off the earned income tax credit, food stamps, and whatever TANF transfers she might still be eligible for. Yeah. She's got 24 adult hours per day of supervision time, where the two-parent family has 48 hours of adult supervision time. She's got no dollars, and she's got kids who are deeply needy of, supervision and developmental input in order to abet their socialization and the development of their cognitive skills and so on. Now, if scarcity is a problem anywhere, it's a problem in that quarter of society where a big chunk of our neediest people are being experiencing their formative years and so forth and so on. Have you guys thought much about that?
Yeah, we have. And I think one way that I think about this is that if you look at across all the domains of scarcity, there's one deeper thing that connects all of them, which right now we call it the attentional suitcase. What I mean by that is that ultimately, whatever your physical domain of scarcity, one of the things that it does is it starts to eat up your mental bandwidth, because you're now devoting mental energy to dealing with that problem. And the problem is, once you start using up some of your mental energy to deal with that scarcity, it squeezes out mental energy for other things. So if you come home from a tough day at work where you've been worrying about it, you're going to be a little more brusque with your kids. Yeah. You're going to be a little less, compelling with them. You don't have the time, for example, to read the thing that just came in the mail or came with your kids saying there's a summer camp. You say, look, I don't have time to deal with it right now. I'm just going to sit here and watch some TV because I just have to unwind. And so now your kid doesn't get to go to summer camp, or you may not show up at the PTA meeting. You may not. So there's kind of what I think we really tax that we forget is that scarcity, lack of time, lack of money starts to tax people's mental bandwidth. Yeah. And once you start taxing people's mental bandwidth, all these other things that they would do when they're in a relaxed frame of mind, when they have energy, start to get squeezed, and it especially matters for children. There's these amazing studies that psychologists have done in the 90s where they looked at air traffic controllers. These are so cool. They looked at air traffic controllers, and what they did was they went to their homes and they had independent raters basically rate the quality of interaction between the air traffic controller and his child. Wow. The air traffic controller and his spouse. And they had someone else keep track of, was it a day at work where there were a lot of planes in the air, or was it a light day at work? Yep. And you see a real mapping of this. The days when the air traffic controller was effectively, mental suitcase was really full, he comes home, and with his kids, he's much, much more short. He's, he's more angry, he's more willing to lash out at them. And with his wife, he's much, much more distant. Yeah. He has no conversation you want to engage.
Notice now, that's fascinating. That's really very interesting. Notice there's I think, a political implication here along the following lines. Suppose we observe that it's the relative malfeasance of parenting behavior that's substantially responsible for educational deficits. Suppose kids' performance in school has something to do with the fact that parents aren't doing their job at home. Suppose somebody argues that seriously about public policy. They say, look, the parents are really not doing their job. It's an issue. They need to be better parents. Okay, and they make a moral issue out of parenting. Right. And they absolve to some degree public responsibility for dealing with the inequalities that result from ineffective parenting. Right. But suppose the ineffective parenting is the predictable behavioral consequence of the scarcities endemic to the circumstances of being marginal and poor in the society. Yeah. Suppose you can demonstrate that with some scientific validity and some predictability about what the magnitude, direction and magnitude of those effects might be. Then a public discourse about poverty that imputes the responsibility at the individual level to parents' malfeasance and indirectly absolves us of a public responsibility, which would imply what? Larger taxes, more transfers, more programs, more creative interventions. I mean, serious interventions that take what we know about human behavior into account. Not some starry-eyed, sort of liberal, dreamy intervention, but nevertheless, acknowledging that the mother on her own, given the stresses and the attendant dysfunctions, can't be expected to perform that parenting role as we might otherwise have had it. That's a very different politics than the politics of so-called personal responsibility, in which we put it on the mother's shoulders and we sit with our arms folded looking at her and saying, why doesn't she be a better parent?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think what I think is very difficult in all of this is that psychologists call this sort of dispositional attributions. I think the biggest mistake that we make in poverty is that we attribute behavior to a disposition, a trait. We say, look, that's the person is like that. Rather than saying it's situational. If I were in that situation, and in fact, if I introspect, I am often in that situation, I would do the same thing. And I think that's, it's one of the stark things. If you see somebody snap at their kids, you've seen some of these documentaries, and, you recoil, like, how could somebody do that with their kid? Yeah. Well, you reflect, hey, I do that too when I'm stressed. And it's that, to me, it's that fundamental empathy gap on which a lot of the politics kind of hinges. Either we've done a good job of conveying that these are behaviors that we all engage in, and it's it really is just an issue of, are some situations bringing more of that out than others? If we've done a good job of that, then I think we're in the right space. If we haven't, then you're right. This whole thing is open to a dispositional interpretation. Oh, look, we're showing that the poor are really bad parents, which is an awful interpretation, but it's one that there is some potential hijacking here that can happen, and it is something that we should be concerned with. But I think the main, at least for me, the main way I think about dealing with that is really creating that empathy of understanding how you yourself do this all the time under certain circumstances. All right. Well, why don't we call it a conversation here? This was a lot of fun, Glenn. Thank you. I have to tell you, I've learned a lot. Let's do it again sometime. Yeah, I'd love to do that. Thank you. Great. Talk to you again, then, Sendhil. Bye-bye. Bye.